cycle on China and Asia Pacific. Let me begin by welcoming and thanking our distinguished guest from New York, Professor Mark Meirowitz, whom I will introduce in a moment. I'd also like to welcome my students and all the participants in this webinar. And thank you for your understanding to keep the videos and audios off to see and hear Professor Mark Meirowitz in the best conditions. Notice that this conference is being recorded and that the recording will then be made available on the OBSERVARE and IDN websites, as well on the Aulas International Relations YouTube channel. This conference is associated with the Advanced Course on Asia Pacific, promoted in a partnership between WOW and IDN, and is part of a vast cycle of conferences that started last May 6. Today, besides Professor Meyrowitz's conference, we'll have other sessions with Professors Carlos Gaspar on the US versus China, Nuno Canas Mendes, ASEAN in the face of COVID-19, and Nuno Magalhães, China and nuclear North Korea. Within a week, on June 24, we'll also have lectures from Professor Toshi Minohara from Japan, Professor Maria Raquel Freire on the Asian politics of Russia, Professor Vasco Rato on the US-China global confrontation, and Leonidio Ferreira about the miracle of democracy and prosperity in South Korea. But without waiting any longer, I'm now introducing Professor Mark Meirowitz, whom I once again thank the honor of being available to share his many insights and perspectives with us. Dr. Mark Meirowitz is Associate Professor at State University of New York, Maritime College, where he teaches American foreign policy, American history, and constitutional law, among other courses. He holds a doctorate in political science, and he is also a lawyer. He lectures and writes on international relations issues, including with respect to Turkish foreign policy and Turkish-US relations, as well as China-US relations. His doctoral thesis dealt with the law of the sea, and he has presented at various international conferences, including the EPAS conference last summer at our university. Dear Mark, we look forward to your lecture on China's political, international law, and military challenges in the South China Sea. So please, the stage is yours, Mark.
I can't open the video, so.
But you can do it.
Perfect. Yeah. Hi. My first remarks are in Portuguese. Let's see how badly I do. Saudações a todos. Hola a todos. How badly did I do? Welcome to everyone, and thank you very, very much, Professor Tomei, for the tremendous honor and privilege of giving a presentation today, and also dialoguing with all of your distinguished participants on the call. I wanted to say first, what a tremendous pleasure and privilege it was to meet you at the EPAS conference and to experience real Portuguese hospitality and welcome, and have had the pleasure at the same time of meeting also Professor Gaspar and the rector, Professor da Silva, and recently had the tremendous fun and enjoyment to teach 2 classes of the wonderful students at the Universidade Autónoma de Lisboa of Professor Paula Pereira, which was a tremendous lot of dialogue and very, very nice interactive program. So I'm looking forward to this discussion today. Now the subject is extremely pertinent. The recent news we have of the clash between China and India that is in the news today reminds us that the world is quite turbulent. And with COVID-19, also, many of the premises and ideas that we have about international affairs or international relations really have been upended and have been thrown into disrepair. We just don't know. A lot of it is scenarios. A lot of it is speculation. I wanted to say before I go ahead that I hope there will be questions and comments and dialogue and discussion on these points, because I'm giving you my views and my ideas on this, and that's certainly, there are many, many ideas and many, many perspectives on these issues. So let me begin with the following ideas. So first of all, if looking at the panorama of the history here, the question is, how do we go from looking at the opening to China, President Nixon, Henry Kissinger, Secretary of State, and assessments as recently as 1999 in a Foreign Affairs article called Does China Matter?, where the commentator said Beijing is a seriously overrated power, a second-rate military power, in no position to matter much as a source of international political power. And now the discussion about China is at the forefront of our discussions on international affairs. Admiral Philip Davidson, US Admiral, said China is now capable of controlling the South China Sea in all scenarios short of war with the United States. The South China Sea has become one of many serious, significant flashpoints in the world today. Vice President Mike Pence said that Beijing is using its power like never before, referring to a clash between a Chinese naval vessel and a US vessel, and that vessel came within 45 yards of the USS Decatur when that American ship was conducting freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea. How did we arrive at the point where Robert Kaplan, who has really written about the book called Asia's Cauldron, I recommend it, he calls the South China Sea China's Caribbean. China, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, Taiwan, and Vietnam all maintain claims in the South China Sea. And these claims, in many respects, are conflicting with each other in the sense that these states are all conflicting with each other, but the one common denominator is China. So what is really going on here? And there's a lot more to say about China-US relations and China and the South China Sea. I'm going to focus on the South China Sea, talk a little bit about what the issues are, and then maybe broaden it up to look at where do we stand in terms of where are we going right now in terms of the China-US relationship and in general in terms of international relations. And really the key points in that determination is really US leadership, Chinese leadership. How is this going to work going forward? Now, what is very, very interesting about this issue is the South China Sea combines all the elements of politics, military affairs, but also law. And the law part of it is particularly intriguing. It ties really into the law of the sea, but this is really not just about the law of the sea. It's really how do you interpret law and whether you abide by international law. There was a UN conference on the law of the sea, and many of the nations of the world got together and tried to codify certain rules related to the law of the sea. I should point out, the United States has never ratified the Law of the Sea Convention. China has approved it. American foreign policy position is that the United States abides by the principles of the Law of the Sea Convention and enforces those through, among others, these freedom of navigation operations, which I'm going to talk about, where American ships are in the South China Sea to assure that these waters are open to everyone. The question is, to what extent does China accept the international legal principles which it agreed to in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea? What is this about? Well, the question is, how do we interpret the rules of the law of the sea related to freedom of navigation and the ability of states to claim sovereign rights over wide expanses of what has traditionally been delineated as open seas? And this is the nub of the issue from an international legal point of view, but really the story is a lot more. But let's just do the international law point of view first and see where the disconnects are and see if we can have a takeaway in terms of what this all means. The conflict or the disagreement here really was a very, very ancient idea, right? There's Grotius and Selden. And if you go back in your history, you know that Grotius believed in mare liberum, which means open seas. The high seas should be open to all, versus Selden's idea of mare clausum, which was closed seas. That is to say, can states actually attain sovereignty over what at least Grotius insisted were open seas, freedom of the high seas. As nation states have expanded their influence, their claims, and also because the seas have very valuable resources in them, there's a tendency to claim sovereignty over areas which were always traditionally the high seas. Now, what happened? Well, the nations of the world got together and had a convention on the law of the sea and codified the rules of law that related the rules of the law of the sea, and to try to deal with the fact that coastal states were making extensive claims of sovereignty to areas of the territorial sea. The United States itself had a conflict with for example, Chile, Ecuador, and Peru in terms of territorial water claims of 200 miles. So at the end of the day, basically, the UNCLOS, a UN Conference on the Law of the Sea, established a maximum extension of a 12-mile territorial sea. It's to be 3 miles, the cannon shot rule, and a 200-mile exclusive economic zone in which coastal states would exercise the right to explore, exploit, conserve, and manage resources, and also set out rules for the continental shelf. Now, here is where this gets very, very interesting, because the situation really came to a head because the Philippines had a conflict with China, and the Philippines took China, in essence, to the Permanent Court of Arbitration under the rules of the Conference on the Law of the Sea, saying that China was violating these rules and regulations, and the Permanent Court of Arbitration then wrote, and I guess we could have a contest to see if anybody could actually read all of it. I think it's hundreds and hundreds of pages, but to boil it down, the Permanent Court of Arbitration summarily, completely, and totally rejected China's arguments. And their argument was that they did have sovereignty over virtually the entire South China Sea based on historic rights related to what they call the 9-dash line or the U-shaped line, which produced an enormous area of sovereign control under China as its exclusive economic zone, or EEZ. And very important point, especially to the United States and to American foreign policy, China also has taken the position that in the exclusive economic zone, that foreign military vessels do not enjoy freedom of navigation. There's also a dispute, obviously, on whether foreign military vessels have freedom of navigation in the territorial sea. That is certainly one part of it, but the more contentious point is that China takes the position that in the EEZ, exclusive economic zone, foreign military vessels do not have a right of freedom of navigation. The United States opposes this position, and to go back to the Permanent Court of Arbitration, as I said, China stated that we have historic rights based on this thing called the 9-dash line, a U-shaped line, and ergo, we're right, the Philippines are wrong. And then the court said, China, you are completely 100% wrong. You're misinterpreting, misreading the Law of the Sea Convention, the provisions of the agreement that you agreed to. And remember the point that China made, which is very important. They said, we had historic rights. And when we entered into the Law of the Sea Convention, our historic rights continued. That means that historic rights are one channel and international law is another channel. Well, the court rejected that, the Permanent Court of Arbitration rejected that. And I should mention, in terms of the proceeding, China really didn't participate. China said, there's no jurisdiction. The court has no jurisdiction over us. And at the end of the day, China rejected the decision of the Permanent Court of Arbitration, and one Chinese official, I think, called it a piece of waste paper, and said it was not, they were not going to follow it. So this is very interesting. And what were some of the points made in that decision? And number one is as follows. Islands. Now, the whole issue has really related to these various islands where China and its neighbors, and the United States is involved also, there are disputes over the various islands, the Paracels, the Spratlys, Scarborough Shoal, which was the principal issue in the dispute with Philippines, Senkaku Islands, a number of these disputes. What they claimed was, and this is a very interesting point, they claimed that, well, you know, they made certain modifications to these islands, And they claimed that these islands have an exclusive economic zone, but the court said that's not correct. Why? Because under Article 121 of the Law of the Sea Convention, it says something about islands. There are islands and there are rocks. An island, the agreement says, or the convention says, is a naturally formed area of land surrounded by water which is above water at high tide. But a rock, which cannot sustain human habitation or economic life on its own, shall have no exclusive economic zone or continental shelf. Now, a rock can have a territorial sea, but it can't have an exclusive economic zone. So what China has done is to militarize and place landfill on these islands for the purpose of creating, in effect, I call them islands, they're actually rocks, so that they can have an exclusive economic zone. The Permanent Court of Arbitration declared that all of the islands in the South China Sea on which China based its claims of extensive sovereignty are not islands, but they are rocks. Therefore, they cannot be used as a territorial basis for advancing China's claim of an exclusive economic zone. Why is this important? Now, it seems like a discussion of, that you would have an international law class. No, but it's very, very important. What the American, I would say, Defense Department and administration has said is that the motivation, and again, this is a placing intent here, with just what's the idea here? The idea is that if you can convert these rocks into islands, and if you can then have those islands, quote unquote, have exclusive economic zones, then you can exclude foreign military vessels from that wider expanse of the 200 miles. And that the United States rejects outright and states that's freedom of navigation on the high seas. And furthermore, in the exclusive economic zone, in any event, foreign military vessels have the right of innocent passage and in the territorial sea. Now, the other issue related to, I looked this up in Portuguese, archipelago, I don't know how you say it in Portuguese, but an archipelagic state that is purely an archipelagic state can use something called the straight baseline approach to delineate its jurisdiction and then measure the exclusive economic zone. So China took the position that it uses that approach in order to draw a straight baseline. And without going through the details of it, you can look on the web, you can look at these complicated diagrams. And that is something that international lawyers have also said has no basis in international law because China is not an archipelagic state. Now, without debating the point, what I'm trying to get at here is the following. China put forward various legal arguments, right? And some have called this lawfare, which is kind of legal warfare, but that's just someone's terminology for it, to really say, this is how we interpret this. But then the court said, it's a court. The court said it's not correct. And in fact, this is an interpretation that can't be sustained. And China said, we don't accept that. And I think that is very important, the fact that a major power does not accept a decision of a court. Now, a lot of this was changed up and down with politics in the Philippines and whether or not the Philippines wanted to pursue this afterwards. There was a period in which Philippines was not interested in pursuing this and was working with China. Now there are some issues about the agreements with the United States and disputes between Philippines and China. But bottom line is, and I'll talk a little bit more about the nations in the states in the area. What's interesting is that once the U-shaped line, 9-dash line was rejected by the court, China came up with yet another interpretation called the four sha. The four sha, which means the four sands or maybe the four islands, and they had this, I'm mispronouncing it, so with apologies, Dongsha, Jisha, Nansha, and Zhongsha, and these are the four sha, and again, these are four island groups, and we're going to measure it, and we're going to do this, archipelagic analysis, and we have the exclusive economic zone and so forth. International lawyers debate this up and down, but they're again, the analysis based on the provisions of the Law of the Sea Convention indicates that it does not appear that China is a archipelagic state. And accordingly, as it is not, like, for example, Indonesia, the Philippines, it cannot take advantage of that legal argument. Now, again, what is the point that I think that I'm trying to make on this? The point is that there either are international legal principles or they're not international legal principles, and it's problematic if a state that is a major power and there are these provisions which were acceded to and negotiated extensively in an international forum, and so that's problematic going forward. So that's the first point. Now, on the freedom of navigation, the freedom of navigation is a tremendously important concept. So what has happened is the United States foreign policy on this has been to engage in what are called FONOPs, or freedom of navigation operations. And that is to say that under international law, and again, as I said before, America never ratified the UN Conference of Law of the Sea. It didn't. This is a political issue. The reason for that had more to do with seabed resources than it did with the resources of the water above the other. There was a lot of interest group, interest group, I'm going to say pressure, but involvement in the law of the sea negotiations. So U.S. never ratified it. Nevertheless, the U.S. stated that it's going to abide by the requirements and rules. And so the United States takes the position that it engages in freedom of navigation operations, or these FONOPs. And this has caused some confusion and problems because there have been some, as I said, with the Decatur and others, confrontations with vessels, Chinese vessels. And again, as I said before, the basic confrontation is that the Chinese position is that foreign military vessels can't come into China's exclusive economic zone as they define it, and they're defining it as extended by these rocks being turned into islands. The other thing is that what's interesting is that China has also used Coast Guard ships in its maritime militia, more so than the PLAN, which is the People's Liberation Army Navy, to do these operations, these maritime sovereignty operations. That's a good thing in the sense that I guess the point is to try not to escalate this up too high and too far to cause a real conflict between the United States and China. Now, I wanted to say one other thing that is very, very interesting, and that is, I mean, it is so ironic to me, having lived through the Vietnam War, that Vietnam, which is the mortal enemy of the United States and responsible for hundreds of thousands of American casualties, is now working with the United States to counter China. And if you're interested to do some research, go and read the note verbal, or the notes verbal, which have been submitted by Vietnam, Malaysia, and others, which basically say, and here's the interesting thing, they depend on the Permanent Court of Arbitration decision, and they say China was involved in an altercation, a problem with Vietnamese fishing. There are constant clashes with Malaysia, Philippines, etc. And all these countries are filing papers based on the Permanent Court of Arbitration saying, we have our own rights. Now, the truth of the matter is that China and Philippines and the other states I mentioned before have their own conflicting issues among themselves in interlocking or, in zones that overlap. But at the end of the day, they're looking to the United States to help them to counter what they see as China's intention to extend its influence in this region. And that to me is the ultimate irony. Now, the question really is, where are we going in terms of this relationship? And I think that it's important to talk about this because many of the scholars are thinking about this. The idea of the opening to China, there's a lot of thinking about this, was to bring China in, bring it into international institutions, work with China, even help to develop China as a major power in the world, to working together with the United States. And what we've seen, regretfully, and particularly in light of the recent COVID-19 situation, is we're seeing a lot of friction. And it's also the rhetoric. The rhetoric. It's not just maybe it's the environment of the discussion is very problematic. President Trump speaking about the China virus and all of that. And then you have Chinese leaders speaking about the United States and accusing them of, the United States of starting the COVID-19. This rhetoric is very, very problematic when it comes between two major powers that should be working together for world peace and not bickering with each other. This is very, very problematic. So the question is that some have been looking at this is what should the United States foreign policy be going forward in dealing with China? And are we on the brink of a new Cold War with China? Because we certainly have the atmosphere for it, and with the COVID-19, and with an election pending in the United States, where a lot of this rhetoric against China is being used as part of the election campaign, it's somewhat worrisome that we are on the way to a real conflict and Cold War with China. Professor Tomei, did you want me to continue, or here's take some points or questions or any?
No, please continue. Then we have enough period for Q&A. Perfect,
perfect. So as I said before about the pandemic, and I think, let me see if there was anything else. On this, again, let me just see if I can summarize my point and concern about the South China Sea. The South China Sea is really not just about law, but the law factor of it is indicative of an attitude towards international institutions. And we saw this also with the World Health Organization. And without opining on who's right and who's wrong, I think it would be a consensus. It certainly is public opinion in the United States from the Pew studies that Americans don't trust the WHO, and they also are very unhappy about China's handling of this whole situation and their sharing of information with the United States. This is very problematic. The World Health Organization, which should be the premier organization to address a pandemic, really had a sad and sorrow-filled behavior here. And then the United States, President Trump gave the WHO 30 days to fix their situation. They didn't. The United States pulled out. And then China came in and said, Xi Jinping said, well, we'll give $2 billion to coronavirus. So, that is just very, very problematic. World Health Organization should function as an independent institution and should, the resolution that was passed at the World Health Organization was, I hate to say, it's like many of the resolutions, the UN itself too. These resolutions are passed, they have no meaning whatsoever. There is zero chance, I'll even bet, anybody wants to bet with me, zero chance that this resolution to find out what happened with the pandemic will ever be implemented. China acquiesced in it. The takeaway from it, I would say, was the very bad situation between Australia and China. And that is very worrisome. Australia called for investigation into the pandemic. And as a result, China, which is the leading trading partner with Australia, imposed crushing tariffs on Australian barley imports, stopped accepting beef from various Australian suppliers. And here is a comment made by a Chinese official about Australia, stating that Australia is like a piece of chewing gum on the bottom of one's shoe that needs to be kicked off. Sophisticated states in the world, and China is a highly sophisticated state, and I say that with the greatest of respect, those kind of statements, and the statements that are being made back and forth about the virus, are just not, I think, appropriate to advance relationships between states and working together for world peace and world stability. It doesn't get you anywhere. And what you end up with is conflict, which continues to increase, and you don't get to the point of world stability. I would say that a great power like China, and that's the same with the United States, there is a certain responsibility that comes with achieving the status of being a great power, of being an important power. China has risen to that status. There's a responsibility there. And part of that responsibility, and I would say the same for the United States, is using rhetoric and interacting with other parties in a way which is appropriate to advance stability and peace. And, you know, these kinds of statements that I've mentioned before really don't do that. Now, the other thing about international institutions and China's participation in them is the fact that, you know, look, the UN is set up with a system of vetoes. There was the one China policy. China became the member in the UN and the Security Council. But if we look at the record of the United Nations and Chinese involvement there, and I would say the same for Russia as well. I mean, it's, you know, the United States, all the great powers have in effect, you know, enervated and weakened the influence of the UN because the UN can't take action against any of the great powers. So the UN itself as an institution really doesn't do anything significant. It hasn't. I mean, it has done, I mean, again, I'm oversimplifying. But again, you know, we don't have we don't have a good structure internationally. Our structure internationally didn't work at all on COVID-19. And now we see that these tensions, particularly between China and the United States, seem to be increasing. And there's a real source of worry. Now, you know, I think in a recent article in Foreign Affairs magazine, Fareed Zakaria, who's a very, very sharp analyst, tries to take the point that we should be working together and trying to do what we can to as he says, to turn China into a responsible stakeholder, and that is still possible. Now, when we look around the world, we do see some areas of concern in terms of that objective. I'm saying from the point of view of American foreign policy. And again, without, you know, I mean, we see the situation in Hong Kong, obviously, and of course, Taiwan is a major issue for the United States. Again, I put a footnote here that President Trump is running for re-election. And when running for re-election, we have a concept in the United States. The former Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill, said all politics is local, and all politics is local because the president is focused on getting reelected. So much of the rhetoric and much of what the United States is doing right now in the administration is oriented to that effort. And of course, we know that President Trump's policies have been very, some extent, one could say, isolationist, or we could call them America First, the Trump doctrine, which eschewed and diminished globalization, multilateralism, internationalism, really were debunked or downgraded. I don't think the Trump doctrine can continue in that fashion in the way the world is being formulated right now. We can go back to the South China Sea. I mean, I think that the United States is taking a very assertive position in the South China Sea, working with the states in the South China Sea, like Vietnam, Malaysia, etc., and supporting those states in terms of their disputes with China over the question of sovereignty. So that's kind of the political aspect of it. There's also the military aspect of it in terms of the militarization of these so-called islands, which is also concerning to the United States. I guess I'm looking at it from the point of view of American foreign policy. But when, again, I wasn't there. This is allegedly the sinking and ramming of a Vietnamese fishing boat by a Chinese vessel near the Paracel Islands is very concerning. And again, it is just one element, one you know, in law school, we learn the idea that a brick is not a wall. Well, there's a brick here and a brick there and a brick there. So building an island, militarizing it, creating administrative districts around these islands, using legal concepts to enclose archipelagic areas, and then measuring from those areas. Doing all of these things, if you take it together, you see that there is a concerted effort here to extend and expand influence and sovereignty. The question for American foreign policy is really what can be done about this. And again, there's a lot of talk about containment in the literature. Should the United States, because this was the philosophy of George F. Kennan and his famous X telegram, his anonymous telegram that was not so anonymous, but he wrote it when he was in Russia to contain Russia. So the question is, should the United States act to contain China's expanding of its influence in South China Sea and in other aspects of its activities? I don't know whether we need a full containment of the same type of what the United States did with Soviet Union, because that's it's somewhat an apple and an orange. It's not exactly the same thing. But if you read Kennan's essay, he says something very important, okay? He says that the shifting geographical and political points corresponding to the shifts and maneuvers of Soviet policy, but which cannot be charmed or talked out of existence. This really had a big impact on me. Kennan's words are, we cannot charm or talk out of existence what we see happening in the world with respect to China-US relations. We can't just talk about it. Or some of the literature talks about talk and take, or talk or take. We just keep talking about it and talking about it. We can't keep talking about it and talking about it because it's problematic. Now, with COVID-19, the world has somewhat come to a standstill, and we're all, I think, pretty much, hopefully, everybody's sitting at home now and having this discussion. I hope I'll hear from your thoughts about this. But we can't continue to have these kinds of conflicts because they're going to be exacerbated. You can't have clashes between military vessels. You can't have, ramming of fishing vessels, or, these kinds of conflicts are not conducive to world peace and will become more problematic as time goes on. One of the things that one of the great concepts, all these concepts came up, soft power, hard power, and then smart power. What's smart? Well, soft power, hard power, China, US, hard power, soft power, all the great powers have diminished in their ability to project their power COVID-19. We don't want to have a hard power conflict with China, but maybe a combination, some kind of a combination of using soft power and well, I don't want to say hard power, I'm thinking more about economic influence, but even that right now is going to be problematic. Well, the concern is that there will be a flashpoint of some type that will exacerbate the situation. I do want to talk for a moment also about the Belt and Road Initiative, because that is very important too. Now, again, is it connected? Well, it's connected in the sense that it appears to be part of a coherent and cohesive approach that China has to the world. And the Belt and Road Initiative is very significant. The other part of it is that there's a military aspect to it in a sense, because we see that in Cambodia, we're seeing it we saw it in Djibouti. China comes in and then they're building ports, and that seems to be triggering some concern. And then we see it in the South China Sea to a great extent, where we see, it's not really Belt and Road, but it's this idea of militarizing the area, militarizing these islands. It's expanding China's breadth of influence in the world, and this is worrisome. On the Belt and Road Initiative, I should say that many of the states that entered into the Belt and Road Initiative are now unable to pay back these loans. Their economies have been destroyed by the pandemic. And I read recently in The Economist that it was the president of an African country who said, I'm canceling this project because my predecessor as president must have been drunk when he entered into this agreement with China. And so, you know, what's happening here? Why are these arrangements being entered into? Well, some might argue to expand Chinese influence. I think that's where I am right now. Maybe we can have some further discussion at this point. Was that all right with you, Professor Tomei?
Yeah, thank you, Professor Meirowitz, for this very stimulating presentation. We are now opening Q&A period. To better organize ourselves, I please ask to those who want to make a comment or question to do so using the little hand or the chat that are on the Zoom bar below so that I can pass the word. So please make your questions, please. I see no little hands. Okay. I'm going to ask first, because I have two questions for you, Mark. Apparently, China will soon establish an air defense identification zone in the South China Sea for the first time, as it did in the East China Sea at the end of 2013. What significance do you attribute to this further step of Beijing in the South China Sea? And what are the effects or the consequences for the stability and security in the region? This is my first question.
Right, well, so that, I mean, that one, certainly the United States is very concerned about that. Again, you set up administrative districts in the South China Sea. You set up an air defense identification zone in the South China Sea. You expand your claims of sovereignty in the South China Sea. Conflicts with the states in the South China Sea. It all appears to be one cohesive and coherent policy to expand influence in the South China Sea. So it's very, very problematic. I mean, other than to say that the United States notes it, is concerned about it, but at the bottom line, at the end of the day, Professor Tomei, I don't know what can the United States do about it? I mean, I don't know that the United States can do a great deal about it, to be very candid. Look, you know, we're in the COVID world now. What is the United States going to do about that? I mean, we have a tremendous disconnect with China right now. The rhetoric is way up there. And it's very, very negative rhetoric. So I think that the answer is it's all part of what is a program on all levels, military, political, legal, to extend sovereignty, influence, and control over the South China Sea. That's kind of how I would, and that's what I'm seeing in the literature and what the Defense Department is saying about it. But what can they do about it? I don't know if there's much that they can.
My second question is not directly related with the South China Sea, but I'd like to have your comment on the confrontation between the Chinese and Indian soldiers in the disputed border of Ladakh region on Monday, with the deaths of at least 20 soldiers in the fight. It is the first deadly clash between the two sides in the border area, in the Kashmir region, in at least 45 years. So what do you think of this clash?
Well, I mean, in terms of what we know about it so far, the parties are really playing down what occurred. They're even saying that many of the soldiers who died from the cold weather and not directly killed by Chinese soldiers. This is what I heard today in the news. And furthermore, but the rhetoric in terms of the heated nationalistic rhetoric is very severe. You know, again, who knows? I'm not an astrologer, so I can't answer the question. But you know what? It's not coincidental that these things occur. I don't know if it's deliberate. I have no idea if it is. I don't know if it was aggression. But again, we see flashpoints in China's international activities, and it's very worrisome. I think this is very worrisome, and we don't want another war to break out. But what we see, and again, I have to say, this is just my point of view. I'm very concerned about Taiwan. I'm very worried about it. There was a time in the United States where Taiwan was the biggest issue in American foreign policy. And this was during the Cold War in particular. and at the beginning and of the relationships that we had with China, which improved with the opening to China. So what it shows you is that you can have a flashpoint that can explode at any time. Although the good takeaway is that the Chinese and Indian leaders, I think, are not ratchet, not going, to the next step in terms of bringing it to a full aggression. That's what I think. They're trying to play it down. The soldiers died of cold weather. So they're trying to. It's sort of like when the United States and Iran had their conflict over the killing of Soleimani, and then they shot a missile, and then the Iranians said, well, we didn't kill any Americans. We didn't, maybe they told us about it. And the Americans said, no, so there seems to be a level of trying to lower the dimension of the heat on this one. But I hope so. Unpredictable.
Okay. We have now a question from Mattia Barbera. Could you please do it?
So, okay, so I'll read it. I'll actually read it because it's a really good question. A peculiar characteristic of China's international projection could be seen in the role of the people, not just trade and finance. This relates to migration, utilization of Chinese workers, and the realization of public works abroad. Students, could you please comment on that? That's quite a quite a powerful question. Yeah, well, I think that that's a very apt point. I mean, this is something that has been focused on, particularly in academia. This is an issue, and that relates to what we call sharp power, which is an interesting concept. And again, I'm not attributing any intention or motivation to it, but the idea that using students and Chinese workers and others to project power, and some have said, and this is those who argue for this concept of sharp power, that the purpose of this is to interfere with democracies. That is the opinion of these pundits. I'm not saying it's my opinion, but the Confucius Institutes and the other ways in which China has projected its power. And Mattia, you make a very insightful point. I can't answer your point because I don't know fully what the intention is, but that appears to be an element of the projection of Chinese influence in the world. But the Belt and Road Initiative, and as I mentioned before, a port in Cambodia and an expansion into Djibouti is very, very significant. So it appears to be part of a coordinated and organized program to project power. If that's the case, then that could be problematic. But again, that's all I can say about it at this time.
Okay.
Caroline.
Another question, two questions in the chat. Carlos is asking, how do you see China's rise and ambitions being effectively checked not by the US, but by the region's host of countries? And Carolina is asking, if we consider China as having threatening and aggressive activities in the South China Sea, how can international courts and the general condemn China for its actions?
Okay, so let's do the first. Let me repeat the first one. Was that in Portuguese actually? Because I didn't see that.
No, it's only sent for me to read it.
Oh, okay.
How do you see China's rise and ambitions being effectively checked not by the US,
right,
but by the region's host of countries?
Right. Well, look, let me say this. Okay, I believe that the only way that I don't think that those nation states can contest or challenge China. They don't have the power to do it. And also, you have to look at these different countries because the element of these countries, and I think is it Malaysia. I mean, some of these countries have many ethnic Chinese, and there are all kinds of different societies and relationships with China and trading relationship with China, which they don't want to interfere with. Okay, they have long-standing relationships. So the only factor that can come in there to really be helpful is really the United States, I believe, particularly in the case of the Philippines, and that's a tricky one because after the court issued its opinion. The Philippines, then Duterte came into power and he said, no, I'm fine. I have no problems with China. He wanted to develop his, now he's kind of thinking this over because of the a defense agreement with the United States and whether he wants to kick the United States out. So to me, that one is a good example of how the United States is kind of the X factor or the key factor in that. Now, the other problem you have when you say those countries in the problem you have is those countries have a conflict with each other. You know, they all have conflicting claims. So I don't see how the only way they're going to get together, I believe, is if the United States can marshal these states together in a unified fashion, sort of like a South China Sea alliance, maybe such a thing exists already, where they get together and the point is to create a code of conduct. There was a code of conduct for the South China Sea and it fizzled out. A code of conduct for the South China Sea to avoid these kinds of clashes and also to eliminate these claims of wide and expansive sovereignty, which are very, very problematic. So at the end of the day, yes, I absolutely think the host countries, I believe American foreign policy, Trump doctrine for the future has to be, I'm going to work with you. It's not that I'm forgetting about you. You're some unimportant country. I'm going to work with you. It's not enough for the United States to do freedom of navigation operations. That's what I feel on that one. Now on the other one, if we consider China as having, yes, Carolina. Okay, so if we consider China as having threatening and aggressive activities in the South China Sea, how can international courts and a general we condemn China? So let's do first the international courts. Okay, I just taught a graduate course in international law last semester, okay? And here's the bottom line, okay? The international law is not like domestic law, you know? It isn't, right? Because how do you enforce it? I mean, how do you enforce the decision of the International Court of Justice? You can't, and the court has no jurisdiction unless the parties come to the court, okay? So that's a court that starts off with no power, and there's no power to enforce it. And as far as the Permanent Court of Arbitration, has no power to enforce it. That doesn't mean it isn't important. That doesn't mean that international law shouldn't be observed. And it has been a basic tenet of American foreign policy to follow and observe international law. And I think that this is an essential element of responsibility of a great power. And China needs to do this. China needs to rise to great power status, but also respect international law. And if the court said that the legal arguments that were being put forward had no basis, which if you read them, I mean, you don't have to be a geographer or it's pretty straight. I mean, again, it's straightforward to the sense that coming through with arguments like 9-dash lines and U-shaped lines and foreshaw and all of this, historic rights, when your historic rights were extinguished when the Law of the Sea Convention was entered into, is very problematic. We need to do better with international courts. We need to bolster international courts, but we need to give them more authority. And then, as I say, subtopic number one, sovereignty. Well, as long as they're sovereign states, you're going to find it very difficult to enforce those decisions. How can, in general, says Carolina, how can yes.
No, there is a question from a person in
I
the
wanted
audience
to do the last
before we
part.
advance
Oh, yeah,
in the chat.
Sure.
Rodrigo Marques, can you put your question, please? Or comment, okay?
Oh, sure.
We are not listening to you, Rodrigo.
Is this Hugo speaking?
There is a problem with your sound. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes?
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you for your presentation. I'm sorry for this trouble. So my question is if we can recognize on a factual basis that China is moving towards consolidating a regional order with China at its center. And if so, is it possible that we'll see a division of the world into different multilateral institutions under those different powers? Thank you.
Rodrigo, right? Rodrigo, very excellent question. You're a thinker. You're thinking about how to structure the world. I don't believe that such a world, or that's a bifurcation of the world, is feasible. It's either going to be, you'll tell me if you agree or disagree. it's either going to be an American world order or a China world order. And an American world order, to my mind, does wrap in China as a responsible party and working with them and trading with China. But I don't think that, you know, I think we're really at a very pivotal point, at a crossroads in the world. But dividing the world, well, you know, in World War II, they tried to divide the world, and they weren't very successful in doing that. I'm not saying it's a comparable thing, but dividing it is not the objective. The idea is to create a world order in which international law, peace, and stability are the key things, and that we don't have, you know, flashpoints and wars breaking out, and that we also have dispute settlement mechanisms. See, I mean, in the South China Sea, there was a code of conduct negotiation to work out, what do you do if you have a problem? And they never worked that out. They have to work that out. They can't have these conflicts because they're going to be exacerbated, and the militarization of the South China Sea is very problematic. So at the end of the day, and I want to say one other point. It's a great point. The American world order, I think I can understand how that works. It's a complicated world order and much debated. The Chinese world order, I don't really see clearly how that works, how the world ends up with that, you know, with that phase of how's that going to look? What's that going to look like in terms of the people who live under it? So Rodrigo, you raise a great point, but I want to hear more about how you envision those two, you know, that bifurcation. I don't know. I know about one. The other one I'm unsure about. So until I know it, I'd like to work out. It doesn't mean that it has to be American hegemony. It has to be, it's kind of Professor Tomei's idea of congagement. I love that idea. It's so original, right? Containment, but engagement, right? Engage, work with, but also make sure that, you know, there's no crossing the line and that you're working towards an international order of stability. That's the best guess I have.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mark, we have two other questions on the chat.
Sure.
José Luis Assis is congratulating you for your brilliant communication, he says. And the question is, what does China really want with its aggressive and ambitious position, particularly in military terms? And Mattia Barbera again is asking if America first and the forging of a global coalition to contain China are compatible.
I'm going to do Mattia first because that one, so let me do that one first. America first and the forging of a global coalition to contain China can be compatible. Yes, well, here is the point. So I've given this a lot of thought, and I have an article I just wrote on this particular point. Very good, Mattia, because America first can be morphed into something a little bit further than America first. America first in its basis is isolationist. It really is. But we've got to move to a new step called America first, next step, right? Which is America as the leader, but of a global coalition. In other words, I know you're going to say to me that President Trump is never going to go for that. But as a practical matter, after COVID, I think there's been a lot of thinking about how the world is structured, and it doesn't work well. It doesn't work well if it's all unilateral and bilateral. It doesn't work. You know, we have to have some kind of a system to ensure, particularly with pandemics and other world crises, that we have a system to work on this. I see, for example, with the belt, again, on the South China Sea, the nations, the states there working with the US, very important. We're not talking today about Europe, but similar ideas, right? And also in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative, the United States could step forward and work with those various states that are in a difficult situation on Belt and Road and try to assist them in the workouts with China, so that, in other words, the United States can work hard to, quote, contain China, but the key is, I like engagement. That's Professor Tomei's idea. I like the idea that we're not crossing over into the containment, the serious and a more aggressive containment of the Cold War with Soviet Union. There is no good that can come from that. All we're going to do is have problems. We are sort of at a juncture here. I think the juncture is work, but it's, you know, America first. You do not have to be a globalist, an internationalist. You do not have to, I'm going to say climate change. I mean, it's a controversial point. You don't have to, you know, do Iran deals. We're not doing Iran today. Maybe another day we'll do Iran. We don't have to do deals like that, but we can still work with other parties. Now, was there another one also? Was there another one, Professor Tomei? I don't know. I don't remember. I can't hear you.
There is the other question from José Luis Assis.
Yes.
On what does China really want with its aggressive and ambitious position, particularly in military terms? And there is two questions from Leandro Barros as well later.
Oh, okay, so on that one, what does China want? I mean, again, this is a very, Chinese foreign policy is very much motivated by ideology. And it's not just ideology. Of course, it is ideology of communism. That is really very significant, but also Chinese philosophy. And I think that you hear Xi Jinping very often quoting, you know, Chinese philosophers and Chinese concepts and Chinese ideas. So it's a combination of the ideology of communism with the unique Chinese element of it. So what does China want? Well, I can't psychoanalyze it. I certainly hope they want to expand, to become a great power that is a responsible power. That's all I can say about it. We can only read and hear what they're saying. I'm concerned, obviously, about the elites in China and their following of communism and communist ideology that we know with the Soviet Union doesn't work very well. And hopefully we can find more of the influence of American democracy. That's what I'll do with that one.
Leandro Barros is having two comments or questions. China is currently the factory of the world, and it holds the power in terms of trade and very strong trade over countries. How are countries going to be able to enforce their claims if they are so dependent on China? And another one, USA is abandoning Europe to focus on China in a way not very coordinated with Europe, in which way this situation can affect the support of Europeans to face China?
Well, I mean, the main point, I believe, right now is the dependence of Europe and the United States and the rest of the world on China for trade. And the best example of that is pharmaceuticals and pharmaceutical components. I mean, that one is that's really problematic because, and we saw this also with the PPE, with the protective equipment, the masks and everything else. The United States has become, and I believe, I don't know what the percentage is on the pharmaceuticals and the components that make pharmaceuticals, China has virtually that entire market. So I think what you need here is to have these nations, Europeans and others, you see Germany trying to do this, and I think Australia and others are trying to become less dependent on China. And you know, this was a realization. I think it was an epiphany when the COVID-19 occurred and people saw, you know, the situation where we were with all of these things. And they said, well, why are we so dependent on China for all of these things? And then we have to remove that dependence. So that's how I feel about it. And I don't agree necessarily, Andrea, that the United States is abandoning Europe to focus on China. I think that you will see, I don't know if the G7 has been rescheduled, but as much as President Trump, you know, he does say what he says, and he says a lot of very, very complicated things and tweets and all of that. But at the end of the day, the United States can't live in a vacuum, and it has to work with Europe. And it particularly has to work with Europe in ensuring world stability. So I don't think the United States has abandoned Europe at all. I don't believe it. But of course, the optimal situation would be to get together with Europe to try to work with China, and particularly to reduce dependence on China for sourcing. And the supply chains, you know, the global supply chains are broken. We have to fix them, but we have to fix them in a way so they're not, again, dependent on China supplying us with everything.
I have a couple more questions in the chat. One is from a cell phone number, so I cannot give the credit for the authorship. And the person in question is asking, after the National People's Congress, we felt that Beijing seems to be in a hurry to start the process of unification with Taiwan, especially because the younger generation are shaping a stronger identity turning more difficult the process as time goes by. Do you think China will use military approach to do it? Since Xi Jinping arrived to power, the speech is getting more aggressive in defending the national nuclear interests. Do you think he's preparing to go on war, or is just observing how the international community reacts to keep expanding its power?
Well, I mean, I think the United States just passed, there was a law passed to protect Taiwan. Taiwan, as I said before, is a key element of American foreign policy. You have a Republican president. And if you, scrape away Republicans and ask them, what do they think of Taiwan as a major issue? Maybe not salient today as it was before, but the conservatives certainly support Taiwan. Look, America is a country that is distracted now because of George Floyd and other issues, are very distracted with COVID-19. But I think that this would be a mortally dangerous step by China. Yes, the rhetoric, they keep on talking about Taiwan and unification of Taiwan. To me, that is an impossibility, and it would ratchet up to a disaster. Now, Hong Kong, I believe, is a litmus test for Taiwan in a way. Although Hong Kong is not the same as Taiwan, because there was an agreement with Great Britain, but we do see how the Chinese have dealt with Hong Kong, and that's problematic as well, and that should be highlighted. So I think right now, would China be so reckless as to try to do that? I think they would not be reckless, because I think with President Trump, and this was exactly with Kim Jong-un, the same thing. Trump says, my button is bigger than your button, okay? That's what he says to. This is how we negotiate. So there's an unpredictability there. So you don't know how President Trump would react to that. So I hope it's only rhetoric, and I hope they don't ratchet it up. Now, you mentioned the younger generation and how the younger generation feels. And I don't know how to react to that, because, I mean, I don't know how the people in the younger generation express their views in the Chinese society. I'm not familiar enough to understand how that works, but it's essentially one party with a leader for life. So I think that, has to be from the top, and to send out a message that maybe they want to have a meeting and talk about it, but to do something about it would be catastrophic, literally catastrophic. I think that was that one.
Yeah, and there is another one from Sigama. How would you describe the repositioning of Japan over ASEAN in relation with growing China as leading power, as well the rise of Asian regional powers besides the US partnership?
Well, I mean, Japan is a rising power, and the question, I think that's another talk, Professor Tomei, to talk about where Japan is, or where maybe you're having a talk on Japan in one of your other programs, but clearly Japan is a competitor, and a significant competitor. But you also have to look at, I keep going to President Trump. President Trump has an excellent relationship with the leader in Japan. America has a very good relationship with Japan, but where Japan is significant in my thinking relates to Korea. In a way, directly, much more so than to China directly, because there used to be the adage that, Korea is a dagger in the heart of Japan. The Japanese are very, very worried about the developments in Korea. So I think that it's a rising power. It's going to want more say over its own defense. And the United States foreign policy has to be able to assure that we have Japan's back, and that we're not going to pull our troops out of Korea. I mean, to me, that to me is the most immediate issue. Now you see with Kim Jong-un's sister that they're blowing up the peace room where they were getting together with the South Koreans. This is very worrisome of what's going on in North Korea. That's really where the worry is. But clearly, Japan is going to rise in power and influence. There's no question about it, and it's to be encouraged. Japan is a great friend of the United States. It's a great friend, same as Australia, Britain, Japan. These are the staunch allies of the United States. And I would say, as an aside, that is I said before about Vietnam. Vietnam has never been a friend of ours, but on the other hand, it's now an ally in this issue with China. And that's the great reversal of fortune that the United States has been able to engender with its foreign policy. Look at Germany and Japan, not only the antagonists, the adversaries, but we had a mortal war with Germany and Japan. And today, Germany and Japan are America's great allies. So America has that capacity to make adversaries into allies and to bolster them. And that was always American foreign policy after World War II, to bolster our allies and help them with Marshall Plan and Truman Doctrine. That's been American foreign policy, is to bolster our allies. So I think that that's still a factor, and hopefully our allies will appreciate it.
Well, perhaps the US should do it also with Russia. There is another question from a cell phone.
That's the next one.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
It is possible to recover in the future the goals of the Trans-Pacific Partnership to counter the growing influence of China in the Pacific region?
Oh, okay. Well, I think the answer is yes, sure, of course. But then that's my Trump doctrine next step, America first next step, is that after COVID-19, and if President Trump is reelected, and certainly if Biden is elected president, I think you will see that trend coming into place, definitely. I think that's a must. You can't just have these other components without that component. I think you need to create the trade partnership component to go with the other things that we talked about to make it successful. I see another one here from Rui. I don't know if that's...
From Rui Paiva, yeah.
Yes.
You have this question: how do you comment what is happening in Hong Kong? And how is, in your opinion, the US pre-elections period dealing with it? And then again, what do you think, if you think China is close to go farther against Taiwan?
Well, I mean, you know, it's like tossing 3 grenades. Tough questions. Really great questions. Hong Kong situation, you know, I was talking to someone yesterday in terms of this issue, and the person commented that the Americans are not focusing on it, and it's regretful. The administration has made some statements on it, the sanctions, this and that. The situation in Hong Kong is very, very worrisome. But it's different than Taiwan, as we said before. The interpretation of what happened in Hong Kong, and in terms of the legal piece of it, because, you know, there wasn't an immediate, I think that what China's doing is accelerating the process in terms of the transition, and that's very, very problematic. There was a whole transitioning process in there. You know, the British left, there was a process, and essentially, the Chinese taking the position that, you know, once the British left, that, you know, that's it. You know, now Hong Kong is part of China, and we can do whatever we want to do. And that is just not what was envisioned at the time. So that's problematic. Now, what is going to happen in Hong Kong? Well, what would happen in Hong Kong is if China carries out its plans to become, one country, and not one country, 2 systems, then you will find that the businesses that are there are going to leave. And maybe now they've been saying that China is going to set up its own business infrastructure in Hong Kong. To me, that is complete self-defeatism. They have to figure out a way to do this. But here is the point I think is important to understand. For China, you know, what is going on in Hong Kong is existentially problematic for them. In other words, in terms of their ideology and their regime. And their malleability and flexibility to absorb that is just not it's not effective. They imposed this law to extradite people. Then they had the National Assembly meeting. They're going very fast to clamp down on dissent, and that's just not something that's going to be accepted. On the other hand, again, I go to the fact that President Trump is running for election, and he's distracted. So Pompeo and Trump will be saying things about it, but are they going to do anything about it? Unlikely. And businesses are going to pull out, and that's going to be they're going to vote with their feet. They're going to go elsewhere. Maybe they'll go to Singapore or Malaysia or somewhere else, and that'll be to China's detriment, I think. In terms of the U.S. pre-election period dealing with it. It doesn't have high salience in the elections. I would point to you, however, election-wise, Rui, to The Economist magazine. This issue, where I think one of the commentators analyzes the view of which president will do, Biden and Trump, how will they handle China? It's quite interesting. At the end of the day, the columnist says that China is not happy with either one, and that different situations will engender. So I refer you to that. Quite interesting. And in terms of Taiwan, Rui, I mean, it's impossible to know that. Although with COVID and with American polarization, it's possible that there will be a perception of American weakness.
Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Rui. Very, very, very nice. Anything else you wanted to say about it? Okay.
Mark, there is a question related to this from José Toga Soares. He's asking you, is Hong Kong an experimental test for a future Taiwan annexation?
I know Jose very well, met him at the EPES. It's a pleasure to be connected again. I can't prove it, but Hong Kong clearly, as I think I said before, is something like a litmus test, I believe, for Taiwan. But whether annexation, I don't know that, but it could be a test. On the other hand, I'm going to argue against myself in the sense that, as I said, the Chinese administration, the way it's set up in its ideology, cannot countenance this kind of protest. They had Tiananmen. We just had the anniversary of Tiananmen, and so I hope that China will work with Hong Kong and try to keep the business in Hong Kong and try to keep the situation there calm and respectful of human rights. That's all I can say about it. But is it a litmus test? I don't know. I don't know what they're planning. I hope they're not planning anything with Taiwan. That would be a world catastrophe, period. That's all. So I hope not. And I hope that the situation in Hong Kong improves, although it could be that, the businesses will just run away, and that would just be a detriment to China. So why do that? But again, the ideology seems to be preeminent, and that's problematic.
Okay, Mark. So we are now finishing this session. Once again, thank you for spending some of your time and many of your thoughts on these topics. Okay. And I will ask to all the audience, please give an applause using these hands on the Zoom bar below. Thank you, Mark. That's very interesting.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you.
And we are counting on you on the next sections.
Sure.
Let me remind the participants that in about 35 minutes, we're going to have other session with Professor Carlos Gaspar on the US versus China. And congratulations, Mark. And thank you again. See you soon.
I was going to say cumprimentos. I hope I could say that. Goodbye. And grande abrazo. You taught this to me. A wonderful reach out to everybody in Portugal. And again, to thank you at UAL and Professor Tomei in particular for your warmth and hospitality and friendship. It means the world to me. And thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Mark.
Okay. So
thanks.
Thank you.
Okay. The session will be in this very same Zoom link. So I see you in about 35 minutes to you all. Thank you. See you soon. Mark, bye. Thank you.